this video, I'm going to talk about some of my biggest takeaways that I learned preparing for my recital from a couple weeks ago. And I think there's some takeaways that will be beneficial for you as well, no matter where you're at in your clarinet journey. My name is Josh Gu, and I'm taking my years of experience learning, teaching, and performing, and sharing all of my best clarinet and music tips so you can get more out of your practice, and most importantly, have fun. You can learn more about all of my many resources at QuickStartClarinet.com, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell to get notified when I post new videos. So if you haven't seen it yet, a couple weeks ago I did a recital that was a really fun program. It was a great time putting it together. It was kind of a really long-term project with a lot of pieces that were in the works for a year or multiple years, and I'm so happy that I was finally able to put it together, and people really enjoyed it a lot, which was fantastic. And I thought it would be interesting, both from sort of a personal perspective, to unpack some of the things, but I think there's also some really good gems in there for you as well, to sort of see my perspective from my professional preparation and sort of review and reflection on how it went, but seeing how that can apply in your clarinet and music journey as well, because again, I think there's some really good gems in there that I think might be interesting for you to know, that even for me as a professional, there's some things that I was struggling with and some things that I noticed that I think are very similar to the things that most people struggle with when they're preparing for big performances like this. So the first takeaway that I think is going to be the most relatable for everybody is that all music is hard. Everything is hard. And that's because it's unfamiliar. I sort of have this idea lately that it's actually, there's no such thing as hard or easy music, because it's all a matter of perspective. What's hard for you might be easy for me. What's hard for me might be easy for Martin Frost. And it's just a matter of perspective and experience and sort of exposure to these patterns and things like that. So when we look at something and say that it's hard, it's not actually that it's hard per se, it's more that it's unfamiliar. And I think anything that feels difficult or feels overwhelming or feels intimidating is because it's unfamiliar. And that's how I felt approaching every single piece on my recital, except for maybe the piece that I wrote, because I kind of knew how that went before I started learning it, so it was already familiar because I wrote it. But that again goes to show that when it's something that's familiar, then it's so much more approachable, it's so much more easy, because you already sort of know what's going on with it. But when it's unfamiliar and you don't know what's going on, it's always going to feel hard. When I was learning the Fin de la Tierra by Jenny Brandon, I think the clarinet part was like 17 or 22 pages or something really long. There was a ton of notes in that piece. It was 17 minutes in total, so there were a lot of notes to learn, and I didn't start working on that music until sort of later last fall, really getting into it, and I was starting to think like, this is a lot of notes, I don't have a ton of time to learn this, and I was feeling a little overwhelmed because of how much of the material was unfamiliar. But I just kept working my way through it, and sure enough, eventually things started to feel good, and I started to learn it faster and faster. And that's also kind of interesting when it comes to learning a piece. Typically, a piece will have sort of its own stylistic things and sort of repeating patterns and themes and motifs that come up across the piece. So if you're really diligent and do a good job of learning the beginning of it, it may feel like, oh my gosh, it took me like a week just to learn the first page. There's 22 pages and the recital's less than 22 weeks away, so there's no way I'm going to make it. But because I really diligently learned the first page or the first few pages, there were some recurring patterns and intervals and things like that that actually made learning the rest of it go faster. And I actually feel like, even though I didn't spend quite as much time on the end of the piece as the beginning, I feel like the end actually came together pretty quickly and felt pretty good, even though some of the fastest notes were in the end, since I was already familiar with sort of the harmonic language and sort of the style of the writing for the piece. It came together faster, and there was already starting to get a little familiarity with it, even though I hadn't actually started working on it. But the big takeaway absolutely is that every single one of the pieces, when I first started learning it, I was like, this is crazy, this is super duper hard, I like have no idea where I'm going with it. But as I got more and more familiar with it, it started to become automatic. And I think you can experience this, and you have experienced this in your playing. If you remember when you learned whatever the first piece you learned was, whether it was Hot Cross Buns, Mary Had a Little Lamb, Twinkle Twinkle, whatever the sort of first piece you remember learning, when you first started learning it, it was really overwhelming and super complicated. But now, it's probably no problem to play those super simple pieces, and you might even still have them memorized because you had to work so hard to get familiar with them. And that idea of working hard to get familiar with it, and that building into long-term sort of success and comfort and familiarity, is actually the big second point that I wanted to make and that I noticed in my playing. Similar to everything being hard and unfamiliar at first to then eventually becoming more familiar, the same thing happened for the fast notes. There were a ton of fast notes in the program and lots of fast finger coordination that I had to work out and learn. And again, in the early stages of practicing, I was like, oh my gosh, like all these quintuplets at 120 beats per minute in the Valerie Coleman piece. In the Jenny Brandon piece, there were sextuplets at 114 beats per minute. So this just like super duper fast notes, and some of the fingerings were really, really awkward. There was one pattern at the very end of the Jenny Brandon's piece that like the first time I played it, I could not even figure out where my fingers were going. It was F sharp to D sharp to F to C flat or B natural, dee doo dee doo dee doo dee doo dee doo dee doo, and leaping from the B into the clarion or into the altissimo with the F sharp was just super complicated and tricky the first time, and it took me about a week of doing that just crazy slow before it started to feel like a familiar pattern that I was more comfortable with. So those kinds of things in the beginning felt super overwhelming, and I think I spent too much time trying to work up towards tempo when I was first learning those things rather than giving them more time to sink in. Because when I was first learning them, I was like, that speed is crazy, it's like incomprehensible at that speed. When I was first learning the Valerie Coleman sonatina, actually I thought, I'm gonna do this like at 116 because at 120 it's just incomprehensibly fast. But as it had more time to sink in and more time to settle in, it actually got easier. And by about a couple weeks before the recital, I was feeling really comfortable and really familiar with these notes and was able to, even in the fast stuff, still comprehend everything, still sort of stay in the moment with the notes. And I wish that instead of in the early days panicking about the tempo and fighting to get things up to tempo, I wish I had just trusted that if I continue doing the patterns slow, deliberate, comfortable, confident, that the speed will eventually come. And I actually did a video a couple weeks ago sort of on that idea that if we just trust in time, the speed will come as long as we're doing it correct, confident, in control, and feeling really comfortable in our practice. And the last takeaway that I wanted to share is kind of more for me personally, but I think might be an interesting insight for you watching as well. And that's the fact that no matter how well prepared you are, it's never going to go perfectly and it's never going to be exactly the way that you want. And that's okay. And I think that's something that we need to accept. We can prepare really, really well and have really good intentions and great preparation for how we want it to go. But in the moment, it may or may not live up to those expectations. But I think that's okay, because I think what we should be doing as performers is not living up to our perfect expectations of it, but just making something that's enjoyable for the listeners. And I think people watching and listening, I think they enjoyed it a lot and found it very good and high quality. Me listening back to it, maybe it's a recording quality issue, maybe not, but I wasn't super happy with the sound quality in general. There's like tons of little mistakes all over the place in it, like little weird things that were unexpected, some of the hard stuff that was expected, that it might be hard to do it perfectly. Even though I could do it exactly how I wanted in practice pretty consistently, there's just so many of those moments that a couple of them here and there didn't come out quite as perfectly, or like something happened getting into it that sort of threw things off a little bit, and then it wasn't set up as well for the really hard parts. But I bet you listening to that hardly noticed any of that. And the reason for that is because nobody, except maybe the composers, know those pieces as well as I know them or knew them in the moment of the recital, because I was working on those and playing through them like basically every day, thinking about them every day, going deeper in the music and getting the clarinet playing how I wanted on them pretty much every day for several days, many days leading up to the recital. So I knew those pieces inside and out, and was able to be really picky because I had a really clear image of exactly how I wanted it to go. So when I listen to it as the performer who knows the pieces the best, it's like mistakes all over the place, things that could have been better, opportunities for improvement, like left and right, like every 30 seconds probably there was something that didn't go exactly the way that I wanted. But that's okay, because as the listener who's less familiar with the music, it probably came across pretty good and was enjoyable and was something that was worth listening to and sort of conveyed the emotions and gave you a pleasant experience. And that's what we need to be doing as performers. Our job isn't to go out there and make a perfect, flawless rendition of the music. Our job is to go out there and give an enjoyable performance for the listeners. And hopefully it was an enjoyable performance. A lot of people left positive comments and said nice things to me afterwards, so I think it was enjoyable at least, even though from my perspective, there were all kinds of things that could have gone better. I'm still really happy with how it went, and that's kind of the big takeaway, is that even if it's not perfect, that's okay, as long as you conveyed what you wanted to convey and gave the audience an enjoyable experience. So those are my biggest takeaways from my recital. Again, if you haven't seen it, you can check it out and watch through it. Again, it was a lot of fun, really, really cool pieces and great music that you probably aren't familiar with, especially because two of them were basically world premieres and the first time that these pieces have been performed. So definitely check that out. I hope that this was helpful and gives you some ideas as you're preparing for your performances. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in another one. And last but not least, a huge heartfelt thank you to the Dennersons. This is like the QuickStart Clarinet family who supports the channel and helps to make everything that I do possible. If you would like to support the channel and get some awesome rewards in return, where we can work one-on-one over video and you can have my full support moving forward on your clarinet journey, then go to quickstartclarinet.com/supporter.